All right, so this next one is how the U.S. Census ignores Afro-Latinos. This is important. It's by Michelle Bueno Vasquez. She is an Afro-Latinx person and a scholar at Northwestern University pursuing doctoral studies. So again, this is another one that's pretty straightforward. I'm going to give you some additional information here. This article mentions the U.S. Census, so I want to clarify the U.S. Census. So there are different types of U.S. Census. The U.S. Census is used to calculate U.S. population, the one that is most often talked about. And that's the decennial the U.S. decennial census. It circulates every 10 years. It is the population and housing census. It's used to account for, and it's intended to be used to account for every resident in the United States and in accordance with Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution. Its function is to determine the U.S. House of Representatives seats for each state. Because each state gets its representative seats based on its state population, having an accurate account of how many people live in a particular state is important because that indicates how many people get to represent your state. It is used to determine federal funding for local communities. It is used to determine funding for education, housing infrastructure, for streets, grocery stores, parking, for medical care and facilities. It helps to determine funding based on funding for basic care and needs of populations in the U.S. The economic census is circulated every 5 years to U.S. businesses to determine statistical data about the economic development in the U.S. and the projected growths in the future. So while the decennial census, that's every 10 years, is for individual people and households, helping to determine how the population is faring economically, the economic census helps to determine how businesses are faring economically. And then the census of governments, which circulates every 5 years, but it's in years ending in 2 and 7, where the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the Federal Reserve Board measures the economic situation, the growth and the debt of the nation. It's used to determine public policy and government budgeting. All of these are used in some way to determine policy and budgeting for our government. All of them in some way impact your lives. The ones that more directly impacts your life is the decennial census because it indicates how many representatives we have at the federal level, because it is a direct correlation between what funding comes into local communities and what funding does not come into local communities. It has more of a direct impact on your life. There's a couple of other terms that are used. The one drop, we talked about the one drop rule last week when we talked about blood quantuming. But again, the one drop rule is a rule that was used to say that if there is even one drop of Black blood in a person, then that person is said to be Black, according to like an official government standing, right? And that meant that they could be excluded from the benefits of that non-Black people could receive in this country, right? Minority racial essentialism is another term. It is a process in which the racial category becomes equated to the image of the group. As non-Black Latino leaders mobilized to add Hispanic as a category, Black Latinos were neglected by federal funding. So minority racial essentialism is basically looking at a particular group of people and equating a singular image to that entire group. So for Latinos, it tends to be of lighter skin. Someone of lighter skin tends to be the representative example of what that group supposedly looks like, right? And so oftentimes that erases Black Latinx folks. A part of racial essentialism and equating Latinx folks with Spanish-speaking even, so not just how you look, but how you speak, leaves out Brazilians, it leaves out people from Haiti, it privileges Europe and Spanish, it privileges whiteness, right? From the What Afro-Latinos Want You to Know video, I want you to think about the description of skin color, the language of Black versus brown, what that tends to connote or mean, what that brings up in people's mind. One of the folks interviewed says that we are in the position we are because there's racism within ourselves, within our people. We don't support each other. Oftentimes when we have those kinds of analysis about the problems that are happening with people who have been colonized or conquered, people who are oppressed and minoritized, is that it focuses an inward lens without thinking about the things that, how these conditions are created, the conditions of possibility that exist for folks to think that lighter skin is better in the first place. That doesn't come out of nowhere. That exists because of the coded messaging that the colonizing power creates, right? That exists for a reason. They talked about being a double minority. Again, think of intersectionality. They talk about beauty standards and colorism. They talk about microaggressions. You're pretty for a Black person. You're well-spoken, different kinds of microaggressions. And we'll talk a little bit more about microaggressions next week. I think it's next week. And then finally, Eden Martinez is a lawyer. She is assistant dean and director of student compliance at Rutgers University. And she does a TED Talk on how systemic racism followed me. She is describing how racism, and particularly anti-Black racism, has been manifest through systems, policies, education, her culture and identity through her history. She talks a lot about the Dominican Republic. So I wanted you to understand, while the Dominican Republic is not one of the US's territories since 1884, and you remember the importance of 1884 is when Africa is colonized, when they do the Berlin Conference. 1884, the US and the Dominican Republic developed a very close relationship, and it builds off of the colonizers' idea that people of color that are lighter skin are better. She uses the word Cocolos, that's Afro-Caribbean immigrants and their descendants. Parsley Massacre happens on October 2nd of 1937. Under the order of the US, the Dominican dictator Trujillo executes more than 20,000 Haitians, and it became known as the Parsley Massacre. So I wanted you to have that information since it's mentioned. The brown bag test that she mentions, the brown bag test is a internalized racist practice within Black communities. The brown bag test is, she mentions Henry Louis Gates, who makes this public, but within Black community, oftentimes the paper bag, the brown paper bag, because colorism exists everywhere, that colonizers said that dictated that whiteness was better. The brown bag test said that folks who were lighter than the brown bag were better, and folks who were darker than the brown bag were a problem. This is a part of internalized racism. This is just akin to systems of colorism. It's akin to the idea that you can improve your race by lightening the skin. It is equating lighter skin with more intellectual capacity, with more beauty, with more kindness, with more morality, with innocence. It is equating lighter skin with those kinds of things, right? Racial microaggressions is the assumption came up in this. It's the assumption like she's a housekeeper. These are more subtle acts of racist ideology. It's the you speak well, oh my God, you're so articulate, or how'd you get here? Or someone on the plane with you and you're in a first class seat and they ask you how you got in that seat. It's that kind of thing, right? It is the notion that you don't belong somewhere that you are, or that you are some exception to the rule for your group of people. You're pretty for a dark-skinned person, that kind of thing. Race refers to the social construction or category of people based on perceived shared physical traits, right? Race is not real. There is no singular group of people who share the exact same skin attributes, hair attributes, eye attributes. There's no singular group of people who share the exact same thing based on their skin color. Race is not real. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is characterized by shared culture. Food, language, music, dress, value systems, traditions, common ancestry, shared history, right? So while race is a construct, ethnicity is not. And ethnicity is broad. It can be very broad across different groups of people, if that makes sense. And I think that is the last slide. Yeah, that's the last slide. So I'm going to end this here. As always, if you have any questions about anything, please let me know. I'm glad to answer them. Take very good care.